Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. I'm going to dive today into a topic that is sort of controversial. It's not the type of thing I normally like to talk about because of the controversies, but I was having a call with a client the other day who asked that I would please create something on this topic. And so I'm going to kind of give you their context for the request as well as what we're discussing, which today is the subject of vaccines, in particular COVID vaccines, and I think the idea here is to ask, what is a logical framework to navigate the current environment and how to make decisions in it. Okay, so that's really what we're going to go through is, some people are going to say they want the vaccine, some people say they don't want the vaccine. That's, to each their own. But I think the more interesting thing, which was kind of what the request was to discuss, what is a logical framework for analyzing and making decisions about it. So I'm going to cover it from my perspective. You, I'm sure, have yours. I would love to hear yours. Put it in the comments below. Hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell. If you'd like help with all the things that we cover here, international tax planning, asset protection, setting up foreign companies, getting residencies and citizenships, relocating to some place that, fits your strategy and your life and the direction you want to go in better, setting up multiple places, please reach out to me. You can book a call, calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer. There's a link in the description below. We can help you with figuring out the right strategy as well as implementing it. Or check out our websites, offshorecitizen.net, offshorecapitalist.com, and send us a message through there. Okay, so let's kind of set a little bit of context here, right? The context is, how do you make decisions in the face of a fair amount of uncertainty? Okay, I think that's really, honestly, this is something I've struggled with and thought quite a bit about over the last, couple years, but in particular the last year and a half, is, when we're, what is the reality of the world today? The reality of the world today is we've got an explosion of complexity. It's impossible to know everything, right? And you have an explosion in scalar effects, and as a result, those two things exasperate each other because the consequences of making a good or bad decision are much greater than they were before, right? So enter, some sort of a virus, right? YouTube is probably gonna, not allow me to do whatever with this video as a result, but anyway, that's fine. We'll see how it goes. Which even the fact that we have to have that discussion is ridiculous. But anyway, whole other conversation. So yeah, enter a virus. Now, there's a certain set of people who will discuss a lot about rights and freedoms. And I tend to be quite sympathetic to rights and freedoms. For a long time, I would have described myself as a freedom guy, right? I like a lot of personal freedom. And I don't just mean that in the sense of, kind of your rights, but, how I structure my life, the hours that I can work, where I can work from, my income, et cetera, right? I tend to be somebody who values freedom. And I've done some videos on different definitions of freedom and, to each their own, right? There's lots of different, I have some clients who tell me, hey, listen, I don't value the right to protest. I value the right not to have to report my finances, and you can play those against each other. Again, to each their own, right? However, you have a group of people who say, hey, listen, I want the freedom to decide what happens in my life, my children, my body, my whatever it is, right? There's another set of people who say, listen, we're in a situation where there is some danger. We can talk in a second about, how much danger that is. And based on that danger, it's necessary to restrict certain freedoms for the collective good. And certainly it's true that one of the great challenges of any society is how do you balance the needs of the many with the needs of the few, okay? Now, I was having a conversation maybe last night, maybe the night before, whatever it was, with some relatives who they're very much like, we're making an ideological stand. We're not going to get vaccinated because we don't like what's happening with personal freedoms. Okay, that's a position. Some other people say, hey, listen, I'm going to go and I'm going to get vaccinated because I want to get through this. I want to protect my health. I want to be in a situation where I have, my freedom. And let's be honest, if you look at what's going on in Europe, etc., there's new rules where if you don't have, in certain parts anyway, if you're not vaccinated, you need a PCR test within the last 48 or 72 hours to go into a cafe. There's some pretty restrictive policies, right? And so how do I think about this? I try to think about this from three different ways, okay? So one is I understand quite clearly the concerns on both sides of like this personal freedoms. And honestly, to me, less about personal freedoms. My concern is less about the personal freedoms and more about government control and government power, okay? That's one side, and I'll discuss that in a second. The second thing that I look at it from the standpoint of is, okay, in the face of what we're facing, what values decisions am I going to make, right? Because I have to deal with consequences regardless of whether I agree with them, regardless of whether I like them, et cetera, and so I have to make decisions accordingly. And the third is, how do I make sense of the available data when there is many pieces of disputing narratives, right? So for example, some people will say vaccines are dangerous. Some people will say, you know, COVID is essentially just a common cold, et cetera, okay? So let's start with that one, because that, I think there's a logical framework you can look at and just kind of work out for yourself, okay? So let's start with, you could go to some numbers, right? And the statistics are pretty clear that if you look at the number of reported cases of serious complications, not necessarily deaths, but serious complications of vaccines, they are incredibly low. It's about 5, in the US, I think it's 5,000 out of like 100 million vaccines given, or whatever it is. It's a very low number, right? Certainly, there are reported cases, but that number is pretty small. If we compare that to COVID, you know, the reported numbers are like maybe 2% fatality rate. If you argue that, you know, the unreported cases are quite high and you have a bunch of people who really died of something else, but they happen to have COVID, maybe you reduce it by a factor of 10, right? So you can kind of work out, maybe it's like 0.2%, something like that. These are just arbitrary numbers. It's not, the specific number is not really the point here. My point is that there is some reported information, right? And the reported information would lead you down a certain path. Now, what people will do is they will cast doubt on the reported information, right? I kind of just mentioned that in the second part, which is, okay, well, there's a reported case fatality rate. If you go to look up the statistics of maybe around 2%. However, if you turn around and you look at it and you say, well, yes, but you know, you are going to have a certain group of people who are going to die off earlier, then you're going to have a lot of people who were tested positive but weren't actually positive, people who died of something else but they had tested positive for COVID, and there's an economic incentive for hospitals, et cetera, to say that they died of COVID and put them on ventilators and all this kind of thing because they get more money for it. Then you have a situation where there's a lot of people who probably got COVID, but they didn't have symptoms, so it wasn't reported. Or I personally know people, friends and business partners who might have had it, but you know, when they called in to say, hey, I might have had it, they said, stay home unless you get serious, don't do anything. So maybe they had it, they're not reported. So as a result, the death rate is probably dramatically lower than the reported death rate, right? This is a reason to cast doubt on that. Likewise, you could cast doubt on the numbers of people who have had adverse side effects to vaccines. You can, I actually made some comment to a nurse the one day. It was quite funny. But anyway, that's a whole other thing. The point is, you know, maybe you could argue that the numbers are higher because for various different reasons, again, you can easily cast doubt on what's going on there. So, you know, what do you do in that state, right? Because this to me is a real, like, it's a serious question of when you're faced with uncertainty, how do you make sense of it? And so the way that I make sense of it, and I think this is something that people can really easily do, is you don't have to trust some of these statistics because you have enough anecdotal evidence to give you some clear indication. So what's the clear indication? How many people do you know who have gotten COVID? Okay, I know a bunch, right? How many people who have gotten seriously ill from COVID? I know quite a bunch. I have people who work for me who have got COVID and been off for 18 days or something like that and quite seriously messed up, and months later have issues with lungs and things like this, right? I know some people personally who have died of COVID, right? So I know that that is happening. And you can go and you can get enough of a sense that, okay, clearly people get sick, Clearly it's more serious than a common cold. And clearly some people are dying of it, right? And just anecdotally, based on how many people you know, like you can just ask yourself, okay, how many people do I know who have gotten a common cold have died? I can't think of a single person in my life who has died of a common cold. So clearly it's worse than a common cold, right? How much worse? Well, that's, you can try and figure that out. But you have some anecdotal data from your personal experience, so you don't have to trust government data if you don't want to believe that, right? The same is true when it comes to vaccines. How many people do I know who have been vaccinated? Lots, right? Lots more than who've gotten COVID, actually. How many of them have had serious reactions, like something beyond like a day or two of, fever and cough or whatever? Like zero, right? I don't know anyone who has had a serious problem. So I can tell you really simply, anecdotally, without needing to do a big study or anything, that COVID is more serious than the vaccine, okay? Now, that's short term, right? Because now we come into the next part, which is a person can say, all right, what about long-term consequences? We'll talk about that in a second. But I want to backtrack because, again, the whole idea here is not to have conclusions, but a mental framework. So I think the whole point is that when you're faced with something where there's a lot of uncertainty, where it's hard to know what's going on, the idea is like, what can you know, right? So I can know the experience of people that are around me, right? I have enough of that data. If it's just one or two, it doesn't really mean anything, right? One person, I could randomly know the person who has a shellfish allergy who goes and gets a Pfizer vaccine and dies, right? That could happen. And if that was the only person, that would be a piece of data that doesn't really mean much, right? But if I know 100 people, 200 people, 500 people who have gotten a vaccine, I have like a reasonable sample of data there, right? It's not a massive sample size, but it's a reasonable sample of data that's going to give me some indication of the broader population, right? Likewise, like I said, on the flip side. So I think that's a useful mental model, right? It's just like, what can I know, right? Because some things I can know, something I can't. Now, of course, you don't want to be fooled by randomness, right? So be aware of that. You don't want to be misguided by taking numbers out of context, right? You don't want to be in a situation where you're misled by your biases, etc. So, you have to have some awareness around that. But this is something that I think is useful. The next thing that we move on to is, so you can basically take that same thought process and you can kind of extrapolate it through. Now let's talk about long-term. You can always be afraid of like a long-term boogeyman, right? The truth is that if I want to cast doubt on people and create fear, etc., I can forever make the argument, we don't know what the long-term consequences will be. And the truth is, I can do that for 20 years. And so in this sense, I think that you need to live life, and I think this is, again, like a good mental framework of saying, okay, there are things that we don't know, and there are things we do know. In this particular case, what we do know is people are getting sick and people are dying, okay? There's a cost of that. And you can say, all right, so what is the cost of treatment, right? You can kind of counterbalance these two. If I have an employee who is off sick for 18 days or 19 days or whatever, what does that cost? That's actually quite a significant loss of productivity, right? That's pretty severe. What does treatment cost? Okay, well, you can kind of counterbalance, and you can do some sort of analysis to come up with a mental framework for where this goes. So, in other words, you have a short-term certainty measured with a long-term uncertainty. Now, you need to counterbalance that uncertainty by the fact that there's uncertainty on both sides, right? You don't know what the uncertainty is around COVID, right? If you're in a situation where somebody's gotten COVID, what's the consequence of that over a year, 5 years, 10 years? Is there some sort of issue with the lungs? Who knows, right? Is it possible that you get an mRNA vaccine and, the spike proteins happen to get into the wrong part of your body and cause some sort of issue that doesn't show up for 10 years, much like asbestos? Yeah, it's possible. That is possible. On the other hand, I do think it's worth understanding a mental model for how things happen, how things get worse, how things cause problems. So this is something that a lot of people don't seem to pay too much attention to in many fields, but is really, really important to understand. I studied years and years ago some things on hazard materials management. And one of the first things they taught us was the difference between poison and cure is dosage, okay? So orange juice in high enough dosage will kill you, right? Water, if you drink too much of it, will deplete your electrolytes and you will die. So dosage matters a lot. And if you look at typically long-term effects of something, the reason why you end up with long-term effects that don't show up short-term is because of the fact that you have increased dosage over time. A good example of this is smoking, right? If you're in a situation where you smoke a cigarette, it's not like that shows up 40 years later and you get lung cancer, right? No. What happens is a person smokes a pack a day for 40 years and they get lung cancer, right? So that increased dosage over time has an effect. And we see the same thing with pollution. We see the same thing with bad foods. Like you can eat almost any food once, right? Doesn't cause a big deal. Having it all the time has this cumulative effect in your body, which is negative. By the way, the same is true with something like asbestos. You can say, okay, great, it gets into your lungs and gradually it works, and you can see the x-rays where basically it kind of like makes these little cuts. But really, protracted exposure to asbestos in particular is what caused it. You can say the same thing with radiation, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's not really that much evidence to suggest if you have a single dose that single dose would suddenly have a significant negative effect long term. It's not impossible, but there's not a lot of reason to believe that that is the case. Okay? But what does this tell you? This tells you that the idea that you would need a booster shot every 6 months becomes very concerning, right? Because now you're saying, well, hang on, what the effects are in the short term, great. We can see that it doesn't seem to be very harmful, right? Certainly it's not, people aren't dropping dead. I certainly wouldn't have been the first person to go out and, get a vaccine. It's very different if there have been 500 million people or whatever who have been vaccinated. You're like, okay, well, not a lot of people dying. So, I know this because I walk out onto the street, people aren't dying. So, all right, this is fairly, I can at least operate on that certainty. But, if you start giving something to somebody every 6 months for the next 10 years, 20 years, what are the long-term effects of that? What's the cumulative effect in the body? Very uncertain, right? Very uncertain. So these are very different problems to look at. And just having a mental model to understand dosage, understanding dosage over time, et cetera, I think is a worthwhile concept. Now, this brings us to the next thing, which is about values judgments. So like I said, I tend to be somebody who values my freedom a lot. And do I like the idea of people going and forcing me into doing things? No, I don't particularly like that. It's, I have like a little bit of a rebellious spirit. Maybe that's part of the reason why I'm doing a channel like this and talking about the subjects that we do. But at the same time, I think that the idea that I would, what's the environment? The environment is basically there's a lot of restrictions if you don't do what they say. So you can say, all right, well, hey, I don't like them taking away my freedoms, so I'm not going to go along with them. All right, perfectly fine. If that's your choice, you can choose to do that. On the other hand, you're kind of giving up the freedom that you were saying you didn't want to give up in order to do that. For me, I love travel, right? Do I want to be in a situation where I can't travel? That doesn't sound so good to me, right? That's going to affect my decision-making process. I once came up with this expression. I said, if you need to become your enemy in order to defeat your enemy, you've already lost, right? Same concept here is if you have to lose the thing that you value in order to protect the thing that you value, then you've kind of already lost, right? So that's a mental framework for understanding it, right? Or for making a decision. The point is that you do have a values-based decision, and maybe freedom isn't the value for you, right? Maybe fighting against oppression or liberty, etc., is something, and that's again like a perfectly reasonable perspective. Maybe based on your analysis, you're not okay with the uncertainty. Now, I would argue that life is uncertainty, so you're going to have uncertainty one way or another, but that's another thing. So the point is, I think the values, you need to weigh out the values and like the real life consequences, right? Not some like ideological thing, but pragmatically, what difference is it going to make in your life one way or another, and what's going to get you towards your goals? When people call me up, often they, will ask about various different things, and what I always tell them is, let's begin with the end in mind. Let's go back to your objective. What are you trying to achieve? So whatever decision you're making, right, whatever way you choose, one or another, how is that in alignment? How is that getting you towards your objective? What is your objective, right? What are you trying to accomplish? And, then what decision is going to lead you closer to there? Okay, so that's a factor. The last thing is speaking towards this whole idea of liberties and government oppression, etc. Because this is very real, okay? Let's not deny the fact that governments are getting more restrictive in certain regards. We just have to look at Australia right now and see that it's, ridiculous, just crazy, as well as lots of other parts of the world. And I think there's a lot of reason to be concerned about that. Now, I think that what I hear some people doing is kind of entangling concepts that shouldn't be entangled, right? One of the things people seem to be really bad at in life in general is separating out concepts, right? It's like, hey, listen, I can pull out this thread and say this is bad, and I can pull this thread here and say this is good. So, for example, let's talk about the idea of them being able to mandate vaccines, right? Now, there's an argument that is perfectly reasonable, which is in giving somebody the power to mandate what can be injected into your body, you are opening up Pandora's box. Like, maybe you agree with this thing, but what about the next thing, right? Now you've given them that power. Very hard to take that power away, right? Another argument, of course, is, hey, listen, you have rights, but you've also got responsibilities, and we've lost our sense of duty, which is really terrible, right? We actually do have a duty, and there are consequences of our decisions. It's not just a personal decision, right? It just doesn't work that way. That would be an ignorant or naive thing to say. But now let's take those two and realize that how do I address these, right? To say that, hey, listen, here's my concern. My concern is that once I open the door, what other things can I let in? Does not mean that you shouldn't open the door, right? What it might mean is I should find a way to open the door while protecting these things that I'm into. For instance, let's use an example. Like, I'm deeply concerned right now, deeply concerned in the world about the erosion of checks and balances within government. What I see basically has been happening is that the government is normally hamstrung in its ability to do things. So what it's doing is it's going after major corporations, which are essentially like choke points within society, and saying, okay, we can't go and impose on the individual. But what we can do is we can make it painful for the big companies, and the big companies will then apply it to the people without due process. And the people have no recourse to the company because it's a private organization. And so the government is basically weaponizing monopolistic or oligopoly type organizations to exert control over people. They're basically bypassing the normal checks and balances, normal due process, normal separations of powers, all these types of things that are supposed to protect you within a government structure. That's really concerning to me. I think that's a big, big problem. Now, what do you do about that? Well, I think you have to address that as its own thing, right? The way to address that is not to say, hey, listen, let's not get vaccinated or something. Like, vaccine, whether a person gets vaccinated is kind of like an independent issue of this issue here. And it's almost a good negotiating point where you can come in and say, hey, here's our concern. We're willing to go along with this if our concern is addressed. And our concern is there needs to be restrictions on power. We need to claw back power. We need to put checks and balances in place. We need to apply due process. We need to have court oversight. We need to introduce some additional rights. We need to whatever, right? These types of things that provide that protective framework. So I think the whole point is that from my perspective, in the things that I see that people are bringing up that I think are really legitimate, I think that the way that you tackle those, and like you need to be able to peel those off from the example of it, right? So an example comes up where there's a possible long-term consequence. Okay, great. You need to be able to peel that off and say, hey, listen, we need to be able to deal with this and this independently. And I don't see that people are doing a very good job of that. I don't see that they're doing a very good job of even clearly separating those out. And I think there's a great opportunity right now for us to deal with this. And we're not really doing it. It's actually quite going the other way. So anyway, that's kind of my mental framework for thinking about these various different layers of this problem. It's obviously a pretty long video. So hopefully, you got something from it, and hopefully as like a mental model or way of thinking about problems, it's helpful for you. Hopefully it applies to more than just this issue. Let me know what you think. Maybe you think I'm out to lunch, tell me. Maybe you think, you got something out of it. Maybe you have something to add. I would love to hear from you. So if you like the video, give us a thumbs up, and I'm going to look forward to talking to you guys on the next video.